On May 23, 1951, representatives of the Central People's Government and the local government of Tibet signed an agreement between the Central People's Government and the local government of Tibet on the measures for the peaceful liberation of Tibet, referred to as the 17-Article Agreement, in Beijing, declaring the peaceful liberation of Tibet. On October 26, 1951, the local government of Tibet held a grand entry ceremony for the People's Liberation Army, and the Tibetan compatriots warmly welcomed the People's Liberation Army. According to the actual difficulties in Tibet, especially the extremely miserable situation of millions of serfs, Mao Zedong decided to enter Tibet and not eat the land. In October, the 18th Army of the People's Liberation Army entered Lhasa. In order to strictly implement this policy, Army Commander John Kawahua and Political Commissar Tan Kwanzan led their troops to march while building roads, and at the same time reclaim wasteland for production. Under extremely difficult conditions, with superhuman will and great sacrifices, the troops entering Tibet built the Qinghai Tibet and Qinghai Tibet highways, which have attracted worldwide attention. In 1956, the democratic reforms in neighboring provinces and regions of Tibet were carried out one after another. In order to maintain the serfdom of theocracy, the feudal upper-class forces in the Zhejiang area took the lead in resisting the democratic reforms by force. In 1958, a large-scale armed rebellion broke out in Qinghai pastoral areas. The rebels in camp fled to Tibet after being attacked by the People's Liberation Army. With the support of the CIA and the separatist forces of the Khaksig government, they regarded the 6-year non-change promise made by the central government to unite the Tibetan upper class as weak and deceitful. The Four Rivers and Six Hills Guards and Teaching Army frequently attacked military vehicles and point guard units, and frantically killed local staff. Before the full-scale rebellion broke out in Lhasa on March 20, 1959, there were still 4 difficult defense battles staged in the Tibet military region. What I want to tell today is the story behind these 4 important defense battles. Many places were besieged, and the old Jinggang staged an empty city plan. Before the general rebellion broke out on March 20, 1959, the skies over Tibet were already clouded. Previously, according to the division of tasks and the actual situation of logistical support, the PLA adjusted the size of the troops stationed in Tibet. At that time, the total strength of the troops stationed in Tibet was only 5 regiments. Just after New Year's Day in 1959, Political Commissar Tan Kwanzan, who was in charge of the work in the Tibet military region, received an urgent telegram from the Zhemu Central County Party Committee, and Zhemu was suddenly besieged by thousands of rebels. Zhemu is an important transportation point on the Sichuan-Tibet line, and there is only 1 platoon of troops, and the situation is very critical. At that time, there were only 159 regiments around the military region, and there was only 1 battalion in Lhasa, which could not move. Tan Kwanzan had no choice but to transfer the 159th Regiment to another battalion to quickly rescue Zhemu. Immediately afterwards, the emergency call came again, and the Jilatong forest farm was besieged. Most of the forest farm workers were serfs who had suffered a lot. They must not be allowed to fall into the hands of the rebels. Tan Kwanzan gritted his teeth and sent out a battalion of the 159th Regiment stationed in high heat. Before he could catch his breath, Ding Qing was in a hurry. There was only 1 company in the local garrison, and the rebels were 10 times stronger than me. Tan Kwanzan had no soldiers to send, so he had to resort to the last resort and ask the military commission to dispatch the Air Force. The next day, the urgent call came again. Zhejiang was besieged by 3,000 rebels, and the Shannon area could not use air support. Tan Kwanzan could only call back, Zhejiang must stand on its own and not rely on reinforcements. Figure author's drawing. What made Tan Kwanzan even more worried was Lhasa, where the news that the Khaksig government and the Tibetan army were preparing to rebel had already caused a lot of trouble. Stabilizing the situation in Lhasa is the top priority. Tan Kwanzan, an old Jinggang, had no choice but to learn from Zhejiang. At this time, the Air Force bombers stationed in Qinghai began to support Ding Qing, and Tan Kwanzan took advantage of this to let out the wind. The People's Liberation Army has transported a large number of troops by plane, and is about to encircle and wipe out the rebel forces everywhere. In fact, there was only 1 airport in Domsung in Tibet at that time. Due to the complex terrain of the plateau, harsh weather, and limited flight range, aviation troops could only perform tasks in part of the airspace in eastern and northern Tibet. Teng Guanzin invited officials and wives of the second rank and above of the Kazakh government to hold a reception on the grounds of celebrating the Tibetan New Year. He once again clarified the policy, clarified the pros and cons, and then turned the subject to the case. However, there is one thing that must be clarified first. I heard that some people still want to rebel. If you still don't listen to my advice, you can give it a try. I don't want Lhasa. For the troops outside the city, use the 2 regiments and 8 companies in the city to guarantee that you will be wiped out. After the show ended, Yu, a member of the female art troupe serving the conference, asked the political commissar curiously. Number 2, how can we have 2 regiments? Your art troupe plus the 16th car troupe, aren't there 2 troops? Where are the 8 companies? Don't we have a Red 8 company? It was in such a situation that the defense battles of several key points outside Lhasa began before Tibet's comprehensive suppression of the rebellion. Saimu Defense War, a big fire. Saimu, who was the first to be besieged, had only a reinforced platoon of 38 people from the 158th Regiment and more than 20 county party committee staff. County party secretary Meng Xianmen predicted that the rebels would come sooner or later, and together with instructor Lin Tian and platoon leader Zhang Swikodi led everyone to build 12 blockhouses, 41 bunkers, and 800-meter traffic trenches in advance, and dug 6 wells. Everyone in the residence stands on guard, and the secretary of the county party committee is no exception. The 18th Army is a military and politically excellent unit. Since entering Tibet, it has always implemented the ethnic and united front policy in an exemplary manner, and has done practical and good deeds for Tibetans all year round. When the rebels approached Bomi, many local progressive leaders and the masses hid in Saimu, such as Jiangkan, the leader of Sumu Zone, all came with his family, and the nuns in the vicinity also came to inform the PLA. The help of these masses played a key role in the 18th Army's grasp of the rebellion. Enzo Kangan Butashi, the commander-in-chief of the religion army who besieged Saimu, and Cai Deo, the local leader, gathered more than 1,600 rebels, equipped with 2 60mm and 82mm mortars each, and 2 heavy machine guns. There are 13 light machine guns and a large number of American-made M1 semi-automatic rifles, and their firepower is higher than that of the People's Liberation Army. January 4, 1959 was Sunday. Just after dawn, 3 signal flares were fired, and the rebels began shelling. The shells concentrated on the county party committee compound, destroyed a radio station and collapsed a warehouse. Buma, the family member of Zhang Deidu, returned fire and killed an 82 gunner of the rebels from a long distance. The county party committee members had already entered the fortifications, without firing a single shot, calmly waiting for the rebels to charge, and then suddenly opened fire to kill and injure the rebels. Under the tenacious resistance of the army and the people, the onslaught of the rebels ended in failure. The next day, the rebels occupied the auditorium of the Kongzang Highway Administration Bureau, condescendingly, and controlled the county party committee compound with firepower. In order to persevere, Meng Xianmen and Lin Tian decided to burn down the auditorium after discussing it, and immediately concentrated firepower to cover it, and sent 2 soldiers with cotton and gasoline to rush in desperately. Back then, Tibet's economic conditions were extremely backward. In Saimu, even a nail could not be bought. All materials had to be brought up from the inland. It was extremely laborious to build a building. It was not easy to make this decision. The rebels, who were about to succeed, were blocked by the fire. The 2nd Battalion of the 159th Regiment of the Reinforcement Army came from more than 1,000 kilometers away. After passing Lindsay by car, they found that the road was damaged, so they had to go on foot. Unexpectedly, they caught up with the heavy snow again, and the feet of Dongs Hilly, the political commissar of the regiment, were froze. The rebels also burned down the Tongmei Bridge, and each company had to rely on a few rubber boats carried by engineers to forcefully cross the Yugongzango River. Along the way, Wu Chen, the deputy head of the regiment, led the team to break through the resistance of the rebels, and marched forcibly for the last 70 kilometers. He rushed towards Saimu with all his strength. At this time, reinforcements from Kamdo in the east also arrived, part of the rebels were wiped out, and the rest rode away on horseback. The Saimu defense battle lasted 13 days. In the face of the disparity between the enemy and our forces, the army and the people were united as one, and finally kept this point. What they waited for was not only the reinforcements they were looking forward to, but also the commendation order from the General Staff. Battle of Zedane, warriors emerge one after another. Zedane is the seat of the Shannon Division of Labor Committee and the only garrison point of the PLA in Shannon. The garrison unit is the 3rd Battalion of the 155th Regiment, led by the instructor Gang Ziliang and the deputy battalion Chang Zhangxianyu. At that time, the secretary of the Division of Labor Committee who presided over the work was Wang Yunyang, and the deputy secretary Zhang Zhengun. There are banks, schools, weather stations, department stores, and other units in Shannon. The attack of the rebels is imminent, and the local staff have also organized battle groups. Zedane is an important town in the Shannon area of Tibet. Figure Xinhua News Agency. The lair of the Four Rivers and Six Hills Guards and Teaching Army is in Shannon. On January 25th, more than 2,000 rebels took mortars, light and heavy machine guns, and explosives airdropped by the CIA to surround Zedane, and first launched a fierce attack on the mountain ridge where the 7th and 8th companies were stationed. The battle became fierce from the very beginning, and at the most dangerous time, the rebels even climbed to the top of the hideout and the bunker. However, the rebels' attacks for 3 consecutive days were repelled by the People's Liberation Army. Frustrated in their assault on the mountains, the rebels turned to Zedane's warehouses and hospitals, and used bombardment, fire attacks, and tunnel blasting, destroying many houses. The fortifications in the southwest corner were bombed, and the rebels swarmed up. At this time, a Tibetan man got up from the soil and slammed a grenade to blow the rebels back. This brave Tibetan became the model of the national militia, Huang Roller. Chen Jinshui, a national model worker in the meteorological industry, volunteered to work in Tibet after graduating from the Beijing Meteorological School, and was assigned to Zedane Meteorological Station. During the battle, the weather station was bombed and collapsed. When Chen Jinshui stood up from the soil, 5 soldiers were still buried underneath. He and several colleagues lay down on the ruins and dug with their hands. First, they dug out the remains of 2 martyrs. 3 more soldiers who were crushed underneath were rescued. The 3 soldiers thought that the rebels had already attacked, and worried that the weapons would fall into the hands of the rebels after death, and use them to kill their own people, so they dismantled the machine guns and submachine guns and buried them in the ground. Each of them held 2 grenades in their hands, ready to die with the rebels. After that, Chen Jinshui, who had just graduated from school, held a gun to make weather records every day. When the rebels attacked, he took up his gun and went into battle. Chen Qiu, who also worked at the weather station, was shot by a rebel while observing, and was only 19 years old when he died. From that day on, Chen Jinshui put a suicide note into his pocket, which said, "After I die, please don't tell my mother that it was not easy for her old man to raise me so big." On March 20, 1959, the Lhasa rebellion broke out, and political commissar Tan Guanzin commanded 13 troops to quickly quell the rebellion in the urban area, officially announcing the start of a comprehensive counter-rebellion in Tibet. At this time, Zedane was fighting inextricably, and the Guardian Army exhausted all means, but was still unable to break through the defense of the 3rd Battalion. After the end of the suppression of the rebellion in Lhasa, reinforcements arrived, and the large troops entered Shannon in separate ways, and Zedane finally broke through. At this time, it was early April, and the defense of Zedane had been fought for 74 days. The Battle of Sadzong, help from the monastery. The siege of Sadzong followed the general rebellion in Lhasa. At that time, Suozong did not have an organized army, and there were less than 60 people in the road squad on the Haikane Highway, including Chinese and Tibetan workers, working groups, and weather stations. At that time, the road workers were all equipped with guns, and there were more than a dozen demobilized soldiers in the working group and the weather station with combat experience, so they set up a militia headquarters to fight against the rebels. Note, Zone is the old name of the county in Tibet. A road squad is an organization of road maintenance workers for railways or highways, and each road squad is responsible for several kilometers of road maintenance projects. The veterans first led the road workers to rush to build the fortifications. After the battle began, they withstood several waves of attacks by the rebels, but the rebels were so numerous that they became more passive as they fought. The old Tenpo, abbot, of Suozong Temple sympathized with the working group and led some militiamen into the temple. This position can form crossfire with the working group compound, support each other, and continue to persist. Later, hundreds of rebels formed a commando and stormed the temple. There were too few people guarding the temple. Under the siege of the rebels, the veterans retreated while fighting, and finally retreated to the top of the temple. The rebels rushed into the temple, and the veterans led the Taoist workers to guard the stairs, and used ropes to hang the grenades downstairs to kill them. The rebels were unable to attack for a while, and began to slash the pillars in the hall with knives. If the pillars fell and the upper floor collapsed, everyone would fall into the hands of the rebels. Hearing the sound of knives and slashes downstairs, the veterans were helpless, and everyone was in a state of anxiety. At a critical juncture, an Air Force's Figure 4 bomber just arrived and dropped 2 bombs, one in the courtyard and one outside the wall, and the rebels were thrown into chaos. The old Kenpo was afraid that the monastery would be destroyed by bombing, so he quickly hung a red flag on the roof. The red flag was given to him by the People's Liberation Army when they entered Tibet. The pilot saw the red flag, turned around and flew away. Before the rebels recovered from their panic, everyone tore off quilts and clothes, tied cloth strips into a long rope, slipped down to the ground one by one, and retreated safely to the working group compound. The old Kenpo insisted on not leaving, and finally fell under the guns of the rebels. The Suozong Meteorological Station is a national basic station. There are 8 charts and reports every day, and there are 2 small ball wind measurements in the morning and one evening. After the commanding heights of the temple changed hands, the weather station was under fire blockade. Although the Air Force came to support many times, the rebels could not be driven away by plane. Under the danger, the observation work of the weather station has not stopped for a day. The weather personnel persisted in their work, and several veterans from the weather station were responsible for covering and shooting at the rebels. During the observation, the bullets of the rebels hit around the theodolite. Sometimes the ball was shot in the air by the rebels with good marksmanship as soon as it was released, and they could only be released again, and they could not be withdrawn until the observation was completed. The bombers of the Air Force were also dispatched many times to support the militiamen to fight tenaciously. It was not until one day that the 14th Mongolian Cavalry Regiment, who was proficient in riding and shooting, came on a leaping horse with swords roaring, and Suozong finally broke through the siege. A dozen veterans of the People's Liberation Army led a group of Han and Tibetan people and resisted tenaciously for 45 days. Defense of Dingqing, stones can be set on fire. Dingqing is more than 300 kilometers away from Kamdo. At that time, there was no road and the location was remote. In chronological order, Dingqing's defense battle started one day earlier than Jammu's, but it ended the latest, so let's talk about it last. Zizu Temple in Dingqing County, Kamdo City, Tibet. Figure Xinhua News Agency. Kamdo was the hardest hit area of the Tibetan rebellion back then. The local rebel leader called Xia Japan was very arrogant and had long threatened to attack Dingqing. Before Wang Zhenting, deputy secretary of the Dingqing County Party Committee, took office, Miao Pai, secretary of the Kamdo Division of Labor Committee, told him, "You must be prepared, and don't expect reinforcements within 3 months." Dingqing's garrison was the second company of the 158th Regiment, and more than 60 county government staff were also organized into 2 platoons. Under the command of the company commander Wang Baoan and the instructor Shi Jiao, fortifications were quickly built. Before the war, Japan sent people to bring cow dung and horse feed. Cow dung is the main fuel in pastoral areas and a daily necessity in Tibetan areas. Sipping Japan uses this to confuse the People's Liberation Army, but it is actually for the purpose of reconnaissance. On the day of the siege, the 2nd Company and 1st Platoon were having dinner when the rebels who had hidden in the houses on both sides suddenly rushed into the gate. The sentry and the deputy company commander were caught off guard and were killed on the spot. Fortunately, the 1st Platoon carried guns while eating, and the entire platoon threw away their jobs and fired back, killing most of the more than 40 rebels. The longest defense battle against the rebellion in Tibet began. Dingqing's rebel bandits gather and disperse impermanently, ranging from hundreds to more than 4,000 at most, occupying all the commanding heights around them. If they are suppressed together, it will be difficult to resist with the strength of the 2nd Company alone. Air Force bombers could only provide fire support, strafing the ground to drive away the approaching rebels, but they could not break out. At that time, the country was not rich, and after entering into a stalemate with the rebels, the county party committee offered not to send planes to help the war, and Dingqing was the guarantor. However, the rebels were afraid of the planes of the People's Liberation Army, and they couldn't tell when the planes would come again, so they didn't dare to get too close. The location of the county party committee was low, and it was impossible to move around in the courtyard during the day. Out of active defense considerations, the second company organized several nighttime attacks, demanding quick strikes and withdrawals, and they had to come back within an hour. As a result of the two night raids, the People's Liberation Army suffered no casualties and pulled out the two most threatening firepower points of the rebels. Based on the information provided by the Tibetan compatriots, the second company also organized a raid on the meeting place in Japan. Although the rebel leader was not captured, dozens of key members were eliminated and the arrogance of the rebels was hit. The head of the military subdivision was very happy about the second company's attack. He had no troops to rescue him, so he issued commendation orders one after another. Like several other defensive battles, local water and fuel sources were tightly blocked by rebels. Every time we went to fetch water from the river, we had to do it under the cover of firepower, and every time we grabbed water, at least one mortar shell and 100 rounds of bullets were consumed. Fortunately, the food and ammunition preparations before the war were relatively sufficient, and the second company used them carefully, giving priority to ensuring water grabs. The hardest part is fuel. The besieged number 2 company couldn't pick up any cow dung, and it seemed that it was going to burn all the firewood. At this time, someone accidentally found a geological record in an old local book, which mentioned that there was a kind of flammable stone in the local area. Everyone searched according to the map, and sure enough, they found this kind of rock oil shale not far away. Although Dingqing shale rock has a low combustion value, it can always boil water for cooking when it is lit, which solves the big problem of eating. The second company was armed immediately and carried back a large number of oil shale rocks. The rebels saw the People's Liberation Army carrying a large basket and a large basket of stones back, thinking that the defenders' ammunition was almost exhausted, so they tried to attack, but the guns of the second company fired very fiercely, without any sign of saving ammunition, and the rebels were full of ammunition for a while. Confused. The smell of oil shale was so strong that it choked the cooks to tears, but the secretary of the county party committee happily brought all the captives over, watched the cooking class cook with oil shale, and released the prisoners after they were full. Immediately spread among the rebels, "We can't win this battle, the Buddha is helping the People's Liberation Army, and even a stone can be set on fire." The counterinsurgency in Tibet is a political battle, and the combination of military strikes and political struggle is an important policy to ensure the victory of counterinsurgency. Dingqing's defenders didn't beat or scold the captured rebels, and took good care of the food, so the above scene happened. The defense of Dingqing lasted for 90 days. When the siege was resolved, gazan flowers had already bloomed all over the field, and summer was here. In January 1959, in the document issued by the Tibet Working Committee, Mao Zedong issued 2 instructions. First, the basic masses must be won over within a few years and the reactionaries should be isolated. Second, our army must be trained to fight. Looking at these legendary defense battles again, there are 2 things in common. One is the concerted efforts between the army and the people, and the rebels are hard to shake if they are united. Those who participated in these defensive battles were infantry units under several old teams of the 18th Army. In the subsequent self-defense counterattack on the Sino-Indian border, the 155th Regiment was the main attacking regiment in the First Battle of Kijelang, and the 159th Regiment was the main attacking regiment in Luomedong. The famous Guoji Troop in China has made outstanding military exploits. The victories in a series of key defense battles bought time for the deployment and assembling of the PLA's counterinsurgency troops. After 3 years of counterinsurgency battles, Tibet launched democratic reforms, overthrew the dark serfdom system, and finally realized 1 million serfs. Turn over and liberate.